Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 1, Crusades prior to the rise of the Ayyubid state. Start of Part 9 of Chapter 3. The Second Crusade. There was a violent reaction in Western Europe to the fall of Edessa into Muslim hands, and it prompted Europe to send another crusade quickly, for its fall instilled fear in the people's hearts, not only because of the religious status enjoyed by the city in Christian history, but also because it was the first state established by the Crusaders in the Near East. Thus its fall came as a warning that shook the structure that the Crusaders had set up in the Near East during the First Crusade, and Western Europeans realized that if they did not hasten to repair this structure, it would soon collapse. The calls for help reached the Pope Eugenius III from the Franks in the East. The Queen of Jerusalem sent a high-level delegation to the Pope seeking help after the fall of Edessa, and the Pope sent envoys to the kings of Germany and France, urging them to hasten to save the Franks in the East from the Muslim danger. At the same time, he appointed one of the most influential clergymen of France, Bernard de Clairvaux, to promote the crusade against the Muslims in the East, and this priest played the same role as had been played by Urban II in 488 Hijri, that is 1095 Common Era, when he had called for the first Frankish campaign. The King of Germany, Conrad III, and Louis VII, King of France, responded to the Pope's call. They each set out with their armies, crossing Europe towards Constantinople, and thence across the Bosporus to Asia. The Seljuks destroyed the German army. The German army set out a few days ahead of the French army. When it reached the area of Dorylaeum, east of Nicaea, the same site where the Franks of the First Crusader defeated the Seljuks under Kilij Arslan 15 years before, the German army fell prey to the army of Sultan Mahmood, the emir of the Seljuks of Rum in Asia. The Sultan retreated in accordance with a smart military plan, until the German army continued its advance towards the heart of Phrygia. Sultan Mahmood had spread his forces across the surrounding mountain peaks, and when the German soldiers reached the Batis River, near Dorylaeum, the Seljuk army attacked them. The Germans were overwhelmed with exhaustion and thirst, and their commanders lost control of them. They tried to seek protection in the mountain passes, but the Seljuks surrounded them and rained down arrows upon them. The German troops lost the advantage of using arrows to keep the Turks away at the time when their horses needed to be fed and watered, at which point Conrad III decided to withdraw and return from whence he had come. But the Seljuks did not leave them alone. They attacked the rear guard, vanguard, and core of his army. Chaos spread through the ranks and heavy losses were inflicted on the troops, with many being killed or taken captive. In fact, the fighting was nothing more or less than an outright massacre in which 9/10 of the German troops were killed. Conrad himself received 2 wounds, one of which was to his head. Conrad III tried in vain to gather the remnants of his army, but fled the battlefield that evening with those of his men who remained, of whom there were few, heading back to Nicaea, whilst the Seljuks seized an unquantifiable amount of booty. They seized everything in their camp, including supplies and horses, and took many of the men captive. The booty continued to be sold in the markets of Muslim cities for several months after that. From this crushing defeat, we may be certain that the German army failed to achieve the goal for which it had come to the east, and this had a negative effect on the Second Crusade. The Seljuks of Rum slowed the advance of the French army. The French army, led by King Louis VII, set out later than the German army. The French forces were more or less equal in number to the Germans, but were more organized, and Louis VII had brought his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine with him. Whilst the fighting was still going on between the Seljuks and the German forces, the French forces crossed the Bosporus into Asia Minor and reached Nicaea, where the French king learned of the defeat of the German king, so he hastened to console and help him. Despite the precautions taken by the French king, the Seljuk Sultan Mahmood caught him unawares in the town of Tisarfios near Antioch and started skirmishes with the Crusaders until he reached the bridge over the river, where a fierce battle took place. The Crusaders managed to fight their way across the bridge, whereupon Mahmoud retreated inside the walls of the city, after which the Crusaders were able to continue on their way, and Mahmoud did not take the risk of coming down to the plain to pursue them. The Turkmen tribes who were spread throughout the border region confronted them and rained down arrows upon them, and they pursued the French and killed some of the rear guard, stray soldiers, and the sick. Nothing saved them from complete annihilation except the fall of darkness, when the Turkmen withdrew. The French army did not reach Antioch until after it had suffered huge losses. After the German king recovered from his illness, he completed his journey to Palestine by sea, courtesy of the Byzantine fleet. The German and French kings met in Jerusalem with King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, his mother Melisende, and senior commanders and clergy of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They discussed the first territory which the campaign would seek to occupy, and they decided that their first target would be Damascus. The Crusader attack on Damascus. The allied Frankish armies headed towards Damascus, which was governed at that time by Mu'inuddin Noor, the Atabeg of King Mujir-ad-Din Abik ibn Muhammad ibn Buri. Mujir-ad-Din was the closest of the Muslim emirs to the Crusaders and had cooperated with them. Hence he did not expect to be the first victim of this huge Frankish army. Nonetheless, when he found out about the Franks' intentions and their march towards Damascus, he took all necessary precautions to defend the city, and he sent word asking for help from Nur ad-Din Mahmud and Saifuddin Ghazi. It was the habit of Nur ad-Din Mahmud to study the international and regional situation, to follow developments and analyze them deeply. Thus he would learn lessons which would help him to determine his future policies. The Second Crusade was the most significant event in the region, and in the whole world, in 543 Hijri, that is 1148 Common Era, and for Nur ad-Din Mahmud it was the first incident of its kind since he had come to power in 541 Hijri, that is 1146 Common Era, and he practiced the approach mentioned above whenever he could. Nur ad-Din was expecting his emirate, Aleppo, to be the first target of this campaign, because the army had formed and headed east against the backdrop of the fall of the capital of the Crusader Principality of Edessa in 539 Hijri, that is 1144 Common Era, at the hand of Imad ad-Din. What happened instead was that the campaign changed its expected goal and headed towards Damascus, which it besieged in an attempt to occupy it. This change was a great surprise to Nur ad-Din, and an even greater surprise to Mujir ad-Din Abik, the ruler of Damascus, and his Atabeg Mu'in ad-Din Onur, the de facto ruler who was in control of affairs in Damascus. The reasons for Nur ad-Deen's surprise have been mentioned. As for the ruler of Damascus, it came as a surprise to him, because he was the only friend of the Franks among the Muslims in that region, and there had been strong cooperation between the two sides against Imad ad-Din Zangi, when the latter was attempting to capture Damascus. Wajir ad-Din was not expecting the Crusaders to attack their friends in Damascus and ignore their main enemy in Aleppo. Nur ad-Din Mahmood learned a lesson from this sudden alteration in the campaign's target. This change did not take place spontaneously, and was not an act of foolishness, as some historians have said. Rather, it came after study and analysis of the situation in the region undertaken by the campaign leaders at the Council of Acre, in which the King of Jerusalem and his commanders took part before the attack on Damascus. It became clear to Nur ad-Din Mahmud that the true aim of the previous Frankish campaign in the First Crusade and in this Second Crusade had nothing to do with taking back the grave of Messiah, that is the Holy Sepulchre, from the Muslims and securing the pilgrim route to Jerusalem along the northern coast to Constantinople, as was claimed by the Christian religious leaders who had planned these wars. Rather, the real aim of the Second Frankish campaign was far removed from seeking revenge for the fall of Edessa. Because the campaign targeted Damascus, the Franks' ally in the region, and did not head towards Aleppo or Edessa where there was someone on whom vengeance might be wrought. Nur ad-Din Mahmud realized that the actual aim of the campaign was to occupy and dominate the Muslim East as the Roman Empire had dominated the region before Islam. In their efforts to achieve this goal, they did not differentiate between the various Muslim emirates and states. In their view, the ally who cooperated with them was the same as those who resisted their domination and expansion and engaged in jihad to free the land from their occupation. Their aim was to occupy and dominate the entire land. For this reason, it was better for them to start with Damascus, which was regarded as the heart of Greater Syria and the largest Islamic emirate in terms of area and resources, and as the weakest in military terms. After that, they would move on to Aleppo, Edessa, Mosul, and elsewhere. This would be a comprehensive war, from which the one who was watching from the sidelines thinking that danger was far away would never be safe. His turn would come, even if it was after a while. As that was the case, Nur ad-Din, with his usual far-sightedness, had no choice but to get involved in this war from the outset. For him, Damascus was exactly the same as Aleppo, and in this situation it formed the first line of defense for Aleppo, Mosul, and all other Muslim lands. Hence he decided to mobilize his army alongside that of his brother Saif ad-Din Ghazi, the Emir of Mosul, near Homs and Baalbek, in order to coordinate with the ruler of Damascus and work out a joint plan of action for confronting the foreign invasion. This coordination was the main cause of the failure of the Crusaders' attack on Damascus. Nur ad-Din Mahmud learned important lessons from this incident, which supported his convictions and previous thinking, including the extreme importance of unity among the Muslim emirates in order to confront the Frankish danger and liberate their lands from foreign occupation. The strategic importance of the Emirate of Damascus in confrontations with the Franks, the necessity of capturing Damascus at all costs, and that European interference in conflicts with Frankish states must be taken into consideration. How the Christian clergy viewed the Second Crusade. As soon as the news of the fall of Edessa at the hand of Imad ad-Din Zangi in 539 Hijri, that is 1144 Common Era, had been confirmed, It reverberated in the capitals of West Europe until it had stirred up a great deal of fear and anxiety. The Crusaders realized that it represented the beginning of the end for the other Crusader states in the Holy Land, so the opinion formed that a delegation should be sent to Pope Eugenius III, asking him to call for a new crusade. In fact, a great movement developed in Europe which called zealously for this campaign to be started quickly, in order to regain the county of Edessa for the Christians. The Pope Eugenius III hastened to summon Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany to lead this campaign. Louis VII welcomed the Pope's request and called his followers to meet him and discuss arrangements. When they did not show any enthusiasm for taking part in the campaign, King Louis VII decided to delay responding to the Pope's call for 3 months, and he turned to a prominent Christian religious figure in his kingdom, Bernard, who was the abbot of the Clairvaux monastery. He enjoyed great fame and his authority superseded that of the king, according to the English historian Stephen Runciman. He had a great ability to convince and influence people, and as soon as King Louis VII and Pope Eugenius III asked him to promote the new crusade, Bernard responded to this request and strove to make this effort successful. As Pope Urban II had stood at Clermont and called for the First Crusade 50 years earlier, Bernard stood outside the church of Vizelle in Shawwal 540 Hijri, that is March 1146 Common Era, calling for the Second Crusade. With his eloquence, he reached the hearts of those who were thirsting for war and adventure. When the people heard his eloquence, they began to call out for crosses, at which point Saint Bernard took off his cloak, and it was cut and turned into crosses, and the abbot and his aides sewed crosses for all of those who volunteered to take part in this campaign. A few days later, Bernard wrote a letter to the Pope which demonstrated the extent of the clergy's influence on the people and the degree to which the people obeyed them at that time. In his letter he said, "I commanded them and they obeyed. The one who issued the order has no authority. The people's obedience to me bore fruit. Barely had I opened my mouth before the Crusaders began to gather with no limit to their numbers. The villages and towns have been deserted by their inhabitants, and there is barely one man for every 7 women. You see everywhere widows whose husbands are still alive." After the success that Bernard achieved in France, his zeal began to increase and he began to travel around Germany, hoping to attract the Germans to take part in this campaign. And he succeeded by and large in convincing Conrad III, King of Germany, to join the Holy War. He asked the German nobility to explain the papal declaration that had been sent by the Pope to all the cities of Europe, so that everyone would take on the responsibility of helping the Holy Land in Palestine and striving to liberate it. The participants in this campaign agreed to attack and occupy Damascus, and the Christian clergy took part alongside the soldiers in besieging Damascus. Conrad had with him an elderly priest called Elias, who had a long beard, whom the people believed in. When they besieged Damascus, this priest rode his donkey, wearing a cross around his neck and carrying a cross in his hand. The priests gathered with the crosses, the kings and knights rode ahead of them, and none of the Crusaders stayed behind except those whom they left behind to guard the tents. This priest stood before the throng and said, "Christ has promised me that I will conquer Damascus today, and no one will repel me." However, his words were proven false when he was attacked by one of the young mujahideen, who killed him and his donkey. The victory of Damascus in the Second Crusade. In Rabiul Awwal, 543 Hijri, The Franks besieged Damascus with 10,000 knights and 60,000 foot soldiers. The Muslims of Damascus came out to confront them with 130,000 men and local troops, of whom nearly 200 were martyred. Then they came out on the second day, and some of them were martyred, and many of the Franks were killed. On the fifth day, Ghazi ibn Atabeg and his brother Nur ad-Din arrived with 20,000 men from Aleppo. The people of Damascus were beseeching Allah for help. They brought the Uthmani Mus'haf out to the courtyard of the Grand Mosque, and the people, women and children, began crying out with their heads uncovered, calling upon Allah sincerely and expressing their need. Allah says, "Is not He better than your gods, who responds to the distressed one when he calls on Him?" Quran, chapter 27, verse 62. One of the causes of victory which Allah granted to the people of Damascus was the arrival of the armies of Mosul and Aleppo at the right time. Both Saif ad-Din Ghazi and his brother Nur ad-Din had contacted Mu'inuddin Unur to coordinate with them against the Franks, and Mu'inuddin Unur, the ruler of Damascus, did not want Saif ad-Din and Nur ad-Din to enter Damascus. At the same time, he was threatening the Franks that he would hand over Damascus to Saif ad-Din or Nur ad-Din if the Crusaders tried to breach it. And yet he sent word to the Christian rulers of Jerusalem and promised to hand over the fortress of Banias to them if they persuaded Conrad and Louis to withdraw from Damascus. This correspondence coincided with the dispute among the Franks themselves about who would rule Damascus after it was occupied. The ruler of Jerusalem accepted the offer of Mu'in ad-Din Unur and convinced King Conrad and King Louis of the necessity of withdrawing, lest the city be handed over to Saif ad-Din Ghazi, the king of the East. For if he captured it, he would then have hopes of capturing Jerusalem and the other Crusader states later on, and the Christian presence would disappear from the East altogether. As a result, the Frankish armies withdrew to Palestine. Conrad sailed to Constantinople on his way back to Germany, and Louis stayed on for a few months before setting sail for France. Thus the greatest Frankish venture ended in utter failure, because of mutual support between the Islamic Emirates Mosul and Aleppo, with Damascus and the Seljuks of Rum in the face of aggression, and because the will to resist was present in the hearts of the leaders. This was in contrast to the situation during the First Frankish campaign, in which the Europeans achieved their aim of occupying most of Syria because of the differences among these emirates, the lack of any will to fight, and the weakness of the spirit of resistance in the rulers' hearts. Nur ad-Din Mahmood was the primary beneficiary of the failure of the Second Frankish campaign, after the ruler of Damascus. The importance of the role played by him and his brother Saif ad-Din Ghazi in forcing the Franks to withdraw from Damascus became quite apparent, as did the significance of cooperation between the Islamic Emirates in protecting it against the Frankish plans. This is what Nur ad-Din Mahmood was striving to achieve as the first step towards unity, which represented his strategic aim of liberating the land from Frankish occupation. After the failure of the Second Crusader campaign, Nur ad-Din Mahmood realized the great importance of Damascus in confronting the Franks. Due to its geographical location facing the largest and strongest Crusader principality, that is the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and to its potential and plentiful resources. Thus the idea of capturing it took root in his mind, and he began striving to achieve that aim by peaceful means, benefiting from his father's experience in this field. Scholars from the Maghreb take part in defending Damascus. Actual participation in the fighting was not limited to the Syrian scholars alone. Some reports indicate that Maghribi and Andalusian scholars living in Syria also took part in those battles. When Damascus was exposed to Crusader attack in 543 Hijri, that is 1147 Common Era, those scholars joined with the army of Damascus in confronting this invasion. Among them were the Maghribi scholar of jurisprudence, Hujjatul Islam, Abul Hajjaj Yusuf ibn Dunas, al-Fandalawi al-Maliki, and Sheikh Abdurrahman al-Halhawni. Sheikh al-Fandalawi was an elderly ascetic and devoted worshipper. Once he went out walking and Mu'in ad-Din saw him. He went over to al-Fandalawi and said to him, "O Sheikh, you are excused. We will take care of it for you. You do not have the strength to fight." The Sheikh replied, "I have sold my soul, and he, Allah, has bought it. We do not let him off the deal, and we do not ask him to be let off." He was referring to the verse, "Verily, Allah has purchased of the believers their lives and their properties for the price that theirs shall be the paradise." Quran, chapter 9, verse 111. He went out and fought the Franks until he was killed. May Allah have mercy on him, as a martyr. Sheikh al-Halhawni was martyred as well, after fighting most courageously. Sheikh al-Fandalawi was seen in a dream after his martyrdom, and was asked, "Where are you?" He replied, "In the gardens of delight, that is paradise, facing one another on thrones." Consequences of the Second Crusade. There are a number of consequences that resulted from the Second Crusade, including the following. A. It led to an accumulation of hostility in Western Europe against the Byzantine Emperor, because the suffering faced by the German King Conrad III and the French King Louis VII during their overland journey in Byzantine territory confirmed the well-entrenched hostility between the two sides. This enmity would continue to grow during the 12th century Common Era, that is the 6th century Hijri, until it reached its peak at the dawn of the 13th century Common Era, that is the 7th century Hijri. B. This campaign had an effect on the nature of the Crusader presence in the East. It may be noted that the Crusader movement was connected to a strategic defensive alliance with Western Europe, which gave it all kinds of material and moral support in order to establish this movement, develop it, and help it to flourish. Indeed, the European alliance gave it all possible protection in the midst of a hostile Islamic environment. Now, after the disasters with which the Second Crusade met, despite all the hopes that had been pinned on its success, it becomes very clear to us that the Crusaders' reliance on outside European support throughout that failed campaign did not help them in any way. It did not even guarantee to maintain the strength that had enabled them to occupy the Muslim regions, so long as their greed had no limit, and it indeed had no limit. The Crusader presence in the East was more akin to an infant that was not destined to grow naturally through its problematic connection with the motherland in Europe. Reliance on the motherland continued to be the weak point of that infant, for which there was no real solution in the mechanism of the Crusader-Muslim conflict. The same could be said for the case of Israel in the modern age. The Crusader presence, using its local resources, was unable to change the situation in 539 Hijri, that is 1144 Common Era, and even its reliance on help from the motherland was not sufficient. That is largely due to mistakes made by the Crusaders, which were of such a serious nature that it became impossible to turn the clock back. From now on, One Muslim achievement would come after another until the Crusaders were finally expelled from the region, by means of correcting the mistakes of Muslim division which had paved the way for the invaders to come to the region. The rise to prominence of Nur ad-Din Mahmud. The Crusader campaign supported the presence of Nur ad-Din Mahmud in Aleppo to a large extent. Despite the Damascenes' fears of his political ambitions, they developed friendly relations with him that were better than before these events took place. They supported his political position in northern Syria more strongly, and the Damascenes implicitly acknowledged the strength of his political influence and asked him to help them against the kingdom of Jerusalem, their former ally. The weakness of the rulers of Damascus. This second campaign of the Crusaders highlighted the degree of weakness that the Atabegs of Damascus had reached, as they were unable to confront the Crusader advance towards them and were forced to ask for outside military help. No doubt this weakness was noticed by Nur ad-Din Mahmud, and that deepened his resolve to unite the Islamic front by incorporating Damascus. The destruction of the fortress of Uraymah. Nur ad-Din Mahmud took advantage of the first opportunity he had to work with Mu'inuddin Onur. Raymond, Count of Tripoli, had sought help from Nur ad-Din against one of the Frankish princes, who had joined the Second Crusade with the French army, Bertrand, Count of Toulouse. Bertrand did not go back with the Franks after the campaign ended, but rather headed north by sea, parallel with the coast, until he drew level with the county of Tripoli, whereupon he came ashore with his knights and breached the fortress of Uraymah, which belonged to Tripoli, and fortified himself therein, announcing his intention to capture Tripoli as he regarded himself as more entitled to it than was Raymond. Raymond was unable to defeat him, so he tried to seek help from the Frankish states. When he got no response from them, he sent word seeking help from Nur ad-Din and Mu'inuddin, who hastened to besiege the fortress with their troops. They captured it, took everyone in it into captivity, and destroyed the fortress, leveling it to the ground. Each then went back to his city. This incident indicates the extent of the bad effect that the failure of the Second Crusade had on the situation of the Frankish states in the Islamic East. The Muslims lost their fear of the Crusaders. A number of historians regard the failure of the Second Crusade as a turning point in the history of the Muslim-Christian conflict. In Syria, it led to a decline in fear of the Crusaders, which encouraged Muslim forces to launch audacious raids on the Crusader states. It also provided the opportunity for another star of jihad against the Crusaders to emerge, namely Nur ad-Din Mahmud Zangi, who revived his father's plan to unite the Islamic front against the Crusaders, which is the plan that would be completed by Salahaddin and was to pave the way for the end of the Crusades. Nur ad-Din succeeded in taking advantage of circumstances following the failure of the Second Crusade to unite Syria under his leadership this time, at the expense of the Emir of Damascus. He then resumed his jihad against the Crusaders with a success which encouraged other Muslim forces such as the Seljuks of Rum, the Artukids, and the Turkmens to confront the Crusaders, especially in Edessa and Antioch, and also to form alliances. In this way, Nur ad-Din Zangi was able to unite all of Syria under his leadership, from Edessa in the north to Haran in the south, and to establish a united Islamic state centered on Damascus. This was the first step towards forming the front that stretched from Euphrates to the Nile to truly confront the crusade. End of part 9 of chapter 3. End of chapter 3.